Many conversations about AI begin with the same question: what could go wrong? It sounds sensible. In many situations, it probably is. But there is a hidden problem there. If that becomes the only question we ask, we end up in a strange position. We refuse to learn until we have certainty, while certainty remains impossible until we learn. That creates a dilemma, at least in my opinion. AI is too important to ignore, yet too uncertain to fully understand in advance. So the real challenge is not choosing between optimism and pessimism. It is deciding how responsible people should act when the future cannot be predicted with confidence. One common response to uncertainty is to focus almost entirely on risk. The logic is straightforward. If a technology could cause significant harm, caution should come first. This perspective performs an important function. It identifies dangers that enthusiasm can overlook. It forces claims to justify themselves. It reminds us that powerful tools can produce unintended consequences. Without skepticism, confidence easily outruns evidence. The difficulty begins when identifying risks becomes the main objective rather than part of a broader process of understanding. At that point, caution can quietly transform into paralysis. And paralysis rarely announces itself openly. It usually presents as a responsibility. More evidence is needed, more certainty is required, more guarantees must be provided. Each request sounds reasonable in isolation. The problem is cumulative. Complex systems cannot meet perfect standards of predictability before they are used. Their effects emerge through interaction with real environments. If uncertainty itself becomes a reason not to engage, then learning never begins. Questions remain unanswered, not because they are impossible to answer, but because the conditions needed to answer them are never created. On the opposite side sits a different certainty. This view treats progress as the central fact. New capabilities appear, adoption increases, development accelerates, therefore the sensible response is to move forward and adapt later. Here, uncertainty is resolved in the opposite direction. Risks become secondary. Problems are treated as obstacles to manage along the way rather than reasons to reconsider assumptions. This perspective often sounds confident because it emphasizes action, yet it contains its own blind spots. Speed can become a substitute for judgment as well, and momentum can begin to look like wisdom. What is really interesting is how similar these opposing positions become once you look beneath the surface. One begins with the assumption that potential harm is decisive. The other begins with the assumption that progress is decisive. Both reach conclusions very early. Both reduce uncertainty by replacing it with certainty. One assumes failure unless safety is proven, the other assumes success unless failure is demonstrated. In both cases, discovery becomes secondary. Evidence is often interpreted through conclusions that have already been chosen. The disagreement appears profound, yet the structure of the reasoning is surprisingly alike. There is, however, another possibility. Instead of treating AI-related risks or benefits as established truths, they can be treated as hypotheses. Not promises, not predictions, but questions. Under what conditions might this work? Under what conditions might it fail? What happens when it encounters real constraints, incentives, and human behavior? These questions sound less dramatic than declarations of doom or progress. They are also more useful. They shift attention away from abstract certainty and toward observation. The goal becomes understanding rather than victory, and understanding requires contact with reality. That contact usually arrives through experimentation. The word experimentation makes some people uncomfortable because it sounds reckless. Yet in uncertain environments, experimentation is often the opposite of recklessness. It is a structured way of learning rather than assuming outcomes. It creates opportunities to observe them, rather than relying entirely on theory. It gathers evidence from practice. Most importantly, it allows beliefs to change. The purpose is not to prove optimism correct, it is not to prove pessimism correct either. The purpose is to discover which assumptions survive contact with actual conditions. Critics sometimes argue that experimentation exposes people to unnecessary risk, and that in certain situations could be true. That concern should not be dismissed, in my opinion. Real-world testing must be bounded, monitored, and accountable, but avoiding experimentation altogether carries risks of its own. If systems are never deployed, many failures remain invisible. Bias cannot be measured, weaknesses cannot be observed, safeguards cannot be refined, trade-offs remain hypothetical. Ignorance can feel safe because it avoids immediate discomfort. The problem is that ignorance often hides uncertainty rather than reducing it. Not knowing is not the same thing as being protected. There is also a practical issue. Refusing to explore a technology rarely prevents its development. More often, development simply moves elsewhere. It continues under different incentives, different oversight, and different priorities. Avoidance changes context more reliably than it changes outcomes. This creates a paradox. Policies designed to minimize risk can sometimes reduce visibility into how risks actually emerge. Development does not stop, learning does. And when learning slows down, society becomes less capable of distinguishing genuine dangers from imagined ones. Of course, this does not mean that every experiment should proceed. Some applications may prove unjustified, some risks may outweigh any reasonable benefit. Saying no remains an essential option, but there is an important distinction between saying no after investigation and saying no before investigation. The first approach learns something, the second often preserves assumptions. One generates information, the other protects a theory. Responsible decision making depends on maintaining the ability to tell the difference. Otherwise, caution risks becoming a way of avoiding difficult questions rather than answering them. A useful distinction emerges here between skepticism and refusal. Skepticism asks what evidence would change its mind. It remains open to revision. It identifies concerns that can be examined, tested, and measured. Refusal works differently. It does not seek conditions for acceptance because acceptance is no longer possible. The conclusion already exists. The conversation becomes permanent objection rather than investigation. From a distance, both positions can sound similar. Up close, they are very different. One encourages learning, the other stops it before it starts. History offers an interesting perspective on this problem. New technologies often trigger predictions at extremes. Some expect transformation so dramatic that existing structures become irrelevant. Others anticipate collapse, displacement, or loss of control. Reality usually proves less cooperative. Major technologies do change society, of course. They alter work, redistribute power, and create unexpected consequences. Yet the most confident forecasts often miss important details. The lesson is not that concern is unnecessary, nor is it that progress should be trusted automatically. The lesson is that uncertainty tends to survive prediction. History also produces an interesting effect on confidence. Every generation inherits examples of predictions that turned out to be wrong. Then, after studying those mistakes, many people become convinced that their own predictions will be different. It is a surprisingly optimistic conclusion. Humanity has accumulated thousands of years of evidence that the future is difficult to anticipate. Yet each new era arrives with a fresh supply of people eager to demonstrate that this time they have finally solved the problem. This is why I think that exploration requires a particular kind of humility. It accepts that important effects cannot be always inferred from theory alone. Some consequences only become visible through use. Some benefits emerge unexpectedly. Some harms appear in places nobody anticipated at all. Learning, therefore, depends on maintaining the ability to revise beliefs. The willingness to change course matters more than the confidence of the original prediction. In complex systems, flexibility often outperforms certainty. Reality rewards adaptation more consistently than conviction. Perhaps an overlooked aspect of this entire debate is that the responsibility itself can be interpreted in different ways. For some people, responsibility means preventing harm by refusing to act until uncertainty disappears. For others, responsibility means engaging carefully so uncertainty can be reduced. Both positions claim the language of caution. Both claim the language of ethics. The difference lies in how they respond to incomplete knowledge. One treats uncertainty as a reason to wait, the other treats uncertainty as a reason to learn. Neither guarantees success, but only one generates new information. The practical consequences become visible inside organizations. The same AI system can produce dramatically different outcomes depending on how it is approached. A company that views AI primarily as a replacement tool may focus on reducing costs. Another may redesign workflows to augment human judgment. The technology remains largely unchanged. The mindset changes. Similar differences appear in risk management. Some organizations treat failures as evidence that exploration should stop. Others treat failure as signals that systems require adjustment. The tool stays the same. The response determines much of the outcome. And that may be the most important insight of all. In the near term, AI's impact will depend less on what the technology can do and more on how people choose to engage with the uncertainty around it. The critical question is not whether AI will save us or threaten us. It is whether we can resist the temptation of easy certainty. Progress without scrutiny becomes careless. At the same time, scrutiny without exploration becomes stagnant. The difficult path lies between them. Not optimism, not pessimism either. Disciplined curiosity. A willingness to test, observe, revise, and learn. Because when the future is uncertain, understanding is not found by choosing a side. It is earned through engagement. Thank you for watching.